Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Technology, Media, and Telecom at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be discussing a research study that pulls together a set of perspectives on technology demand and some of the implications and really some of the insights that we've gained from a lot of the data from this. To discuss it with me today is Research Director Liam Eagle and Analyst Malav Parekh. Welcome back to the podcast to you both.
Thank you very much, Eric. Super excited to be here.
Thanks, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here. I want to talk about something that really is a product of our Voice of the Enterprise panel, something actually are perspectives that we've had for some time, looking at really directional intent. We've looked in the past about budgets and things of that nature, but really wrapping all this together with the technology demand indicator is really something that's new for us, and it offers some new and interesting insights. Liam, can you give us a little background into what it is, where it came from, and what it's offering?
Sure. So a couple of key points. So first of all, it's the U.S. tech demand indicator for now. So right now, it's very focused on U.S. demand specifically. And interestingly, to your point, it is partly based on Voice of the Enterprise, but also, and I think Malav can get into this a little bit later probably, is it's also based on some of our Voice of the Connected User landscape and macroeconomic surveys that we've been conducting, some of them for many years. So we can share a lot of details about that. But just to talk about what we've done is it's the tech demand indicator is kind of a representation of intention to spend money on technology among businesses and consumers in the US in the current and coming quarters. We've based it on a composite of responses to survey questions about expected changes to technology spending from individuals that are making those decisions in both of those categories, so business and consumer. And the composite score that we put together represents this sentiment on a 100-point scale, with 100 representing a kind of universally positive intent to increase tech spending, and 0 representing kind of a completely negative intent. Now, it doesn't really land at either of those poles of the scale, but a score greater than 50 kind of denotes an overall positive sentiment, and less than 50 would denote an overall negative sentiment. So we just released our Q3 2023 results at the end of Q3. So the information that we gathered during the quarter, for now, it is, and so this was sort of our official launch of the tool, the function. And for now, it's something we see ourselves updating on a quarterly cadence. We expect the Q4 results to come out in early January in 2024.
Oh, wow. I was, of course, skipping right over the fact that this is a much broader expanse of perspectives than we've typically put together. And insights, in fact, are spanning our regular, full, broad enterprise capabilities as well as consumer side with Voice of the Connected User landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually hoping we could talk about where this fits in the kind of research landscape that we have. And so, I mean, it's kind of a new addition to our thinking about how we work with and deliver survey-based data about user demand, right? And it's a new way for our clients to interact with information that we're collecting. So the core deliverable from a survey from us has typically been a complete set of results from an individual survey. And here what we've done is we've really focused on picking specific results from a selection of different surveys that we've been conducting, some of them, as I said, for more than 10 years, to support a composite that we see as kind of an effective use of that data to model intent to spend on technology. So rather than just delivering the data, we're building a very specific insight from the data. And then, on top of that, where in the past we might have delivered survey data in kind of a flat Excel doc or in a static chart, here where we've built an interactive presentation of that insight, allows the user to play with the levers and really shape the delivery or the presentation to fit their use case. So very specifically, it's Power BI dashboard with a bunch of different sections that details different areas of the results that we're looking at. And then, I think I would call out that one other thing that this report represents, or this product represents for me, or from my perspective, is this kind of connective tissue between the user sentiment data that we've been gathering over here in the, sort of 451 research group for years within the market intelligence organization, and then kind of the market data and the representative market index work that's being done within the larger S&P organization. So the material that we've produced kind of references facts of the S&P 500 and the Global 1200 for comparison and for validation of some of the suggestions that we're making.
Well, that's, I think, the thing that I find so fascinating about this data is that these are, from the analyst side, this is the source data is something that we've been working with for ages. And we've had it in all of these disparate places. We've had all sorts of interesting perspectives. We've had technology verticals that you could look at, the different aspects of budgetary intent that were all out there. But this is really bringing all of these together into an integrated perspective, and one that now is using a whole bunch of data visualization tools, dashboarding capabilities that now put this front and center and integrate those perspectives across those areas. That's the thing that I find it's the fascinating and insightful part of this.
Yeah. So I think from my perspective for a researcher, I think it's a supporting signal. I think it's a complementary set of insights to what we've been doing for quite a long time and to what everybody is doing in the various sort of topic-based research channels within the organization, but specifically zeroing in on that vector of appetite to spend on technology and then tracking changes in that appetite over time, presenting it in a way that I think of it as contextual. I think of it as kind of a high-level contextual view of what the research practices can take and deliver more detailed insights under that umbrella. Or if a particular user or a client wants to double click, we can take them there. So Malav and I are actually both in the process of working with different groups within the TMT research organization to develop reports that draw on what we're doing in the tech demand indicator and tie some of that into what we're seeing in the channels as a kind of a useful tool for helping to tell that story.
More context.
One great example of that already is the merger and acquisition team who used TDI data to explain the context of increase in acquisition of small businesses, IT businesses. So that's an excellent report and a very good example of how our data can be used.
Well, and in that example, they're really using, to Liam's point, they're using that context and color for the indicator to be able to really provide that backstop of levels of M&A activity, right? That's, I think, the interesting thing about where they've gone with this, which is that in light of that overall spending intent, some of those indicators about directionality, the ability to contrast that with the activity levels in the M&A world give an interesting perspective and a contrast to, okay, hey, this is what's driving this. This is where this fits. These are the kinds of things that could be part of the story of why these trends are moving, and that extra depth to understand what causes that movement and what's really driving it.
It's interesting from a user's perspective. One of the things that we hope this tool can provide is a demonstration of what they might want to do with the data that they have access to via our systems, right? So in the past, the model has typically been, specifically with respect to surveys, I think has been, here's the results of the survey. Here's what we think it might, or here's what we think it probably means. And I think this is just an additional layer of, here's what you can do with some of this information to create a kind of historical view of trends. Here's what you can do with some of this data to create, in fact, something that could be a predictive view of what the market might do. So I think it's almost a demonstration or a kind of how-to for people who would want to do something interesting with our survey data.
Well, it seems like one of those things where we've got, as with most industries, there are cycles, there are patterns. Being able to take a look at historical data for here's how sentiment has progressed, here's what happened in activity in the past, to be able to do, to your point, to provide some thought about, when we've seen these kind of sentiments, when we've seen this kind of direction in terms of expectations for spend, when we've seen these kinds of things happening, here's what happened historically, and to take a look and I contrast that with things that could potentially be happening as we look at shifts in market, expectations, and sort of where those are going. It's that interesting part, and we've talked about it on previous episodes, which is the end user data perspective, which is this is sentiment. And it is the understanding of those buyers, those end users, the end consumers of the technology. That is that interesting human end of this. It's people's understanding of where things are in their general realm and what they're expecting to be able to do, which I think is always that interesting contrast to helping add that level of perspective in terms of not just raw numbers, to maybe get something that gives us a slightly leading view in terms of directionality.
Yeah, definitely. So it occurs to me that we haven't really talked about what the findings of the the tech demand indicator are. So
Not
I
a
could
bad idea to actually. So
I could tell-
what in point
yeah.
of fact, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so we released our findings a few weeks ago for Q3, and the signal of technology spending intent that we tracked during Q3 was a slightly negative 48.93 out of 100. So that means organizations in general are feeling slightly negatively about spending money on technology right now. That's not a one-to-one. And you made a great point there that what we're really measuring here and tracking is user sentiment. It's not a census of spending. So, and it's not a one-to-one, sentiment is not a one-to-one match with spending. So, a slightly negative intent to spend on technology doesn't mean negative market growth. What it more likely means, based on our observations of the relationship between this signal of intent and the technology business over time, is we expect kind of a slight drag on the rate of year over year quarterly revenue growth that is reported or will be reported by companies in the technology center or sector when they've finished reporting their Q3 results. And we do that by kind of zeroing in on the information technology segment and the communication services segment of both the S&P 500 and the Global 1200 indices. And we find that there's moderate to strong correlation with the directional movement of our signal and the sort of directional movement of that sort of revenue growth number. So our Q3 number was a slight decline from the Q2 score, which was a little bit higher, 49.72, but which was still in the negative range. And also the Q3 number was lower than it was a year ago. It was lower than the 3-year average, which was 51.7. So, Q3 was the fourth consecutive quarter in which this number has been in the sort of negative range. But what we've seen is there are some signs that the pessimism around spending, the trend that we saw was 2021, during the pandemic, there was a lot of spending being done to accommodate a lot of the changes that the pandemic was imposing on the world of business, right? People were
Right. All
moving into
those
remote.
urgent remote work, all the things that were taking place in the
Exactly.
market, the heavy duty panics in IT teams, all the rest.
Yeah. A lot of the changes that we had to make during the pandemic, early during the pandemic, cost money, and people had to spend money on that technology. The sort of continued existence of the pandemic in 2022 made that a period of pretty consistent negative, sort of directional trend for technology spending. People just wanted to tighten their belts and be careful with their money because they weren't sure how long this was going to last. And what we've seen in 2023 is cautious recovery, I would call it. And as Malav has pointed out to me, we're still in the negative range. People are still feeling careful and cautious about their spending, but Q2 this year was a pretty notable improvement from Q1. And frankly, it was the first improvement that we had seen quarter to quarter in exactly a year. So that was a positive sign. Q2 to Q3, again, we're not just on an upward trajectory forever again, but the early signs for Q4 suggest that it may increase again in Q4 and in fact might enter the positive range during that time. The other thing I would call out is the projected numbers that we have for Q4. We collected immediately prior to the emergence of new conflict in the Middle East. So we recognize this could affect willingness or desire to spend on technology in a few different ways in the short term. And so we're continuing to monitor the results that we're getting in to try to identify if there's a discernible impact of that yet on what intent to spend might be. So we'll obviously update and let folks know if we see anything there.
And that is one of those things. When we're looking at sentiment, everything that's going on in the world at large does in fact impact that. And there is that balance between what's the extent to which sentiment starts to shift, what is it the actual buying behavior does in response, and then how do the markets react on top of it? Yeah. a lot that comes into this from a complex mix of signals, but interesting to see that those insights are actually playing out the way they are. What do you think are the important pieces or the ways in which people should be using this data?
So one of the things we've heard is important to users about this information is the ways that they're able to shape it. And so we're delivering this through an interactive dashboard. So they're able to sort of tailor the view to fit their use case. And part of that is breaking down the signal of tech demand at a demographic or firmographic level. So while it's strictly based on US signals, as I mentioned before, and that the segmentation they're able to do doesn't include a geographic view, but they're able to break it down across business versus consumer or business vertical market, business revenue, company size by headcount, consumer by household income, and see some interesting detail there around, variations in intent. So for instance, right now we see that software and IT services is a category where we're seeing a stronger intent to spend than some of the others so for instance, financial services or retail where it's significantly weaker. The other thing we're able to do is break it down by intent to spend on what specifically. So exactly what type of technologies businesses are demonstrating a stronger intent to spend on. And there are a couple of standouts from that. But in particular, we see this kind of emergent story around the role that AI is playing in business intent to spend on technology. I'm sure you're very excited to finally be talking about AI on this podcast.
Again and again.
But, it's interesting, as it is this huge trend, like to start with AI is one of a couple of areas where businesses in general are expressing a positive intent to spend. So during a period where, as we've said, that overall attitude towards spending on technology is in that negative range, the sort of changing role of artificial intelligence in the technology landscape is making it one of the points of positivity with respect to spending intent, along with a couple of the, what you might expect, maybe usual suspects of things that folks are spending money on: cloud computing, information security. And so the other two, cloud and InfoSec, are the top ranked technologies where folks show a positive intent to spend. And those are pretty consistent, broad ranging areas of spending. Cloud infrastructure and services has a score of 66 on our scale. Information security, a score of 63.7 on our scale. And those are supporting pieces of a lot of other technologies. And in the sense that organizations need to secure the things that they're doing, regardless of what it is, and they need to supply the compute and the storage to those things, regardless of what they are. Those are kind of inured from cutbacks and from negative intent in that way. They're not the first places that organizations look to make spending cuts. AI, on the other hand, has a positive score of 61.4. It's not like those other areas of technology in the sense that it is in the process of transforming from or transitioning from being kind of an emerging experimental technology to being considered a critical business tool. So part of that is the AI projects require information security spending. They require cloud computing spending. So we're seeing the implication that AI during the next couple of months is a real driver of overall IT spending in some of those areas, and in some of those areas that are really moving the needle for spending in general. It's a pretty interesting view.
Well, it's some interaction and interlocking that happens between those two of them. Oh, yeah, interesting stuff. Malav, what are your thoughts about the data and some of the insights that you've gleaned?
So, like Liam said, that the data that we have goes back to several years. Actually, some of it goes back to 20 years. And that kind of shows that you have sort of examples of how some of the things play out based on various macroeconomic factors. And we do map those macroeconomic. In fact, we map almost 20 different macroeconomic factors that play out in business sentiment. And one thing that has emerged since the pandemic is that IT spending cannot be seen in isolation. If it is a part of the overall budget, and if the overall budget is getting affected, a lot of it will affect IT, maybe not linearly, but there is an impact when there are cost cuts. So right now, the economic challenges, and we continue to see them, and any new factor which pushes that economic uncertainty to the negative or positive will have immediate impact on IT spending. So that's kind of what our data shows. We've seen over the years the impact of inflation, interest rate hikes, even energy prices, and all of that is kind of factored into the final sort of number, which is right now negative or below 50, to be more accurate, which is the average. So yeah, our data shows for now that it's going to there be some improvement in Q4, and that's kind of likely, but the new macroeconomic conditions, traditionally conflicts do not impact IT spending to a greater extent. Specific areas get impacted like security and some of the other impacts, but there are some sort of knock-on effects like impact on energy prices, impact on some other trade issues. So as things play out, we may see some impact, which is negative on IT spending or certain aspects of IT spending. And some may even push positive IT spending, like in security. So that's what our data shows and has shown traditionally. And we've been able to map it through how the size of a business of a particular size reacts to it differently than to a macroeconomic condition differently when it comes to IT spending. Then a larger business or an older business with a lot of legacy systems is going to respond differently to digitalization than or spending on IT than a new, smaller business, which is quick to or easier to pivot and has a more positive opinion towards IT spending. We can all
that's an important point, which is attitudes about spend and directionality within that spend as well.
Absolutely. And then we have new technologies, and I know Liam would elaborate on that, but impact on new technologies on spending sentiments. For instance, like he mentioned, that we've been seeing a decline in IT spending sentiment over the past 4 to 5 quarters. And businesses are looking for new avenues to grow their business. To improve their revenues. Ultimately, it's all about revenues and bottom lines. So they're either increase in sales or decrease in cost and improvement in efficiency. So any technology that, as our data suggests, any technology that would enable one of those two things will get a lot of attention. So suddenly productivity, efficiency are words that are top deciders for technology spending, or much bigger influences of technology spending than they were traditionally.
Yeah. Well, again, in competitive markets, when there's an expectation of upswing, investment's going to move towards hopefully making the opportunity more competitive and increasing output, those sorts of capabilities. I guess I'm curious, what's your thought about how organizations should leverage this data? It seems like looking at some of the trends and some of the impacts is something that from a predictive response, hopefully can give you some insights. But how should they put this data to work?
Yeah. So my sense is that from a client's perspective, we hope this provides a useful component of the data that they're using to build their view of the technology market. So we expect this is something that they're incorporating with the other signals that they're receiving and exploring, how they're attempting to predict the future, to make decisions from a corporate strategy standpoint, or to understand where the market's going, to maybe time marketing spend to coincide with when businesses are looking to spend money on technology, to maybe benchmark their own performance against what we're describing as the appetite to consume technology. So if their revenue is down during a time when the market is likely to be up, that might be a warning sign for them that they're not doing something right, or that they could be doing something differently. And then from our perspective as a research organization and thinking about how this fits into the rest of the research that we do, we also hope that this is a jumping off point for digging deeper on some of our other research. So as Malav and I have been developing the reports that we put together about this signal, we're including our findings from the tech demand indicator data, and we're pointing to some examples of really complementary research that we feel demonstrate either supports what we're describing or helps to explain what we're describing, or describes a consequence of what we're describing. So we hope that that leads users to want to dig deeper on specific topics, because again, the tech demand indicator is a pretty high level signal. We're looking at the roles that certain business segments are having in driving the overall sentiment score. So for instance, we're tying it into SMEs and Malav's work on the SME Tech Trends survey. For example, we're looking at the relationship between sustainability and tech spending, which is something that I recently did a survey about in the Digital Pulse portion of Voice of the Enterprise. We're looking at the ongoing need to acquire new technology skills in more detail or more specific technology skills as an area of spending. We're looking at, as Malav already mentioned, sort of tech M&A and its relationship with the overall attitude around and toward spending on technology. So, we think this is connective tissue. We think this is a jumping off point. We think this is context. And we think this is something that can help people understand what's coming.
Well, I mean, as we've seen, no signal stands on its own, but it seems like the TDI actually has so many connections to so many different aspects of the data that we're looking at. As you're saying, connective tissue to be able to link many of these perspectives together.
One thing I'd love to flag is that our ability to gather these signals and produce this material is really, it's thanks to the participation of our 451 Alliance members. The Alliance is the panel of IT professionals that are involved in making decisions about technologies at their organizations that we go out and survey with a lot of our different survey work. They very generously give us their time to take our surveys, and in exchange, we give them a curated view of the data that we're producing from some of these things. So they're kind of a special panel in the sense that their motivation is the outcome of the work. And so they're putting in good information, or they're interested in putting in good information. And so we're getting good information out of it. And we greatly appreciate their participation. And speaking of participation, I would love to just extend the invite to anybody that's listening to the podcast, Eric, if they're involved in IT decision-making at their organization and they'd like to see if the Alliance is something they'd be interested in contributing to or finding out more about, 451alliance.com. They can get more information and we would love to have them.
And I will have a link once again in the show notes because, you raise a really important point. This is all based on this participatory research organization, the 451 Alliance, which, again, is that nice internally referential. Basically, you participate, you get access to the data, you get insights as part of the process of actually creating this wonderful data. But absolutely in the show notes.
Eric, and if you can, just an optional insight and completely up to you and Liam if you guys want to include this as well. So the benefit of this data from our tool from the IT spender point of view would be to just know what others are doing. And that in itself, sometimes just to be able to understand that, hey, it's all right to spend more on a certain particular technology because, that's kind of the trend is not a bad thing because it's kind of comes as a sort of approval of your own insight. And on the other, sorry, yeah.
I was going to say, that's the great thing about the Alliance data, which is that you've got peer data perspectives that can help you justify budgets and identify, hey, look, the market as a whole is spending more in these particular areas. If we're going to remain competitive, we have to keep up. Here's what our peers are doing. Here's how you slice that data and take a look at it.
Absolutely.
Help to identify what those trends are within those verticals. Yeah.
Yes. And from the vendor point of view, it's important to know that if there is a drag and from a certain segment of the market, or if there is a positive intent in a particular segment of the market, so they can tailor their offerings based on those requirements. I think that's kind of very valuable for vendors as well. So it's a useful tool for everyone from that point of view, because we are using insights from both the buyer side and the vendor side. So I think that's kind of very unique about this indicator.
Oh, good points on both sides of that. Well, I will have links in the show notes to both the TDI and the 451 Alliance capabilities, and we'll point our listeners that way. And this has been great having you both on. Thanks for being back.
Thanks, Eric. We had a great time.
Pleasure to be here. It was great.
And some valuable insights, which I hope our listeners will take advantage of. But that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. We are at time. I want to thank our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Carolyn Wright and Caitlin Buckley on the marketing and events team, and our agency partner, the 199. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be talking about some broad perspective research that's taking place in, I'm going to say it, generative AI, but also taking a look at some of those impacts on climate and a lot of things that are coming out in a whole set of big picture reports coming out this fall that we can give you a heads up on. I hope you'll join us then, because there is always something next in tech.